I'm Vali Nasser, the Dean of Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. And it is an honor to welcome everyone to this afternoon's event on cultural diplomacy. Relations between governments are typically driven by factors such as national interest, security, geopolitics, and economic prosperity. But the cultural exchange of ideas, values, and traditions between states often occurs against the backdrop of these more pressing motivations. Yet it has proven critical in fostering and solidifying peace and stability around the world. Cultural diplomacy influences relationships between governments in parts of the world where political tensions may run deep, where new relationships are just beginning, or where traditional policy means are less productive. We can be sure that historical relations between China and the United States, or the American rebuilding of post-war Europe through the Marshall Plan, was bolstered by the strong cultural bonds and affinities between its peoples. Today, cultural diplomacy is a vibrant and innovative academic field of research and has successfully established itself as a standalone theory and practice. The United Nations is at the forefront of this field as one of the leading practitioners of cultural diplomacy in the world. So it is our pleasure to discuss this work today with UN Messenger of Peace and world-class violinist Midori. And it's also an honor to host this event with my fellow dean, Fred Braunstein, who is the Dean of Johns Hopkins University's Peabody Institute and a lifelong musician, educator, and leader. Dean Braunstein joined the Peabody Institute in 2014 after serving as president of the renowned St. Louis Symphony since 2008. And prior to that, he served as president of the Dallas Symphony Orchestra. The move from being a successful chief executive of American symphony orchestras to a university and conservatory is a natural extension of Dean Braunstein's commitment to the formation of young musicians. And additionally, his focus on community engagement, innovation, and diversity and inclusion continues to benefit the entire Johns Hopkins family. And I'm very grateful for his initiative in putting this event together today. I would also like to express my gratitude to Professor Kent Calder, our moderator for this afternoon, and the director of the Reischauer Center for East Asian Studies. And this event would not have been possible without his effort. Dean Braunstein will introduce our panelists and the course of events today. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming him to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vali, and I want to express my gratitude to Dean Nasser and to SAIS for hosting this event, and we're thrilled to be here and to be able to be part of this. I have the distinction of being able to introduce our panelists today, and they are really a remarkable group, as you will see. Beginning with Midori. Midori has been, just tell you a little bit about what she's been doing at Peabody as a distinguished visiting artist over the past year. She's done a series of master classes with our conservatory students as well as with our preparatory students. She has participated in a panel discussion with Hopkins Professor of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, Kay Redfield Jameson, exploring the link between creativity and mental illness, and of course her participation here today. And I think, you know, it goes without saying that Midori is, I think all of you know her as a world-renowned violinist. What you may not know about her is that she is also the United Nations Messenger of Peace, and as we've seen this year at Peabody, a living example of what it means actually to be a 21st century musician. She's the founder of Midori and Friends, several other organizations which work to bring music and music education to underserved audiences. She is a gifted educator. She is also distinguished professor of violin at USC's Thornton School of Music. So I'm going to ask Midori to come up here and join and don't you come up? I'm going to introduce people. And actually, you know what? I'll introduce everybody and we'll bring everybody at one time. So that way you won't be sitting up here by yourself. Jeffrey Brez is the United Nations Chief of NGO Relations, Advocacy, and Special Events. He's worked for 4 United Nations entities and the World Bank Group on issues including children's and women's rights, refugee assistance, child soldiers, health, education, sustainable agriculture and food security, environmental sustainability, anti-corruption, and climate change. He's lived on 4 continents and speaks fluent English, French, Italian, and Japanese. And he holds a Master's of International Public Policy from SAIS. Ashley George is Executive Director of the Charlize Theron Africa Outreach Project. She has overseen dramatic growth of the foundation, increasing the grant making, the number of grantees funded, communities served, and youth engaged in the organization's vision of achieving an HIV-free generation. She also oversees Charlize Theron's other philanthropic activities, including partnerships with UNAIDS and the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria. She's committed her life and career to finding new ways to leverage the power and influence of entertainment to achieve lasting social change. Evan Ryan is Executive Vice President of Axios, a new media company focused on politics, business, media, and tech. She previously served with Secretary John Kerry as Assistant Secretary of State for Educational and Cultural Affairs, working to increase mutual understanding and promote peaceful relations between the people of the United States and the people of other countries. She's worked with NGOs, including Peace Players International, the Clinton Global Initiative, and the Education Partnership for Children of Conflict. She holds a Master's in International Public Policy from SAIS and is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. And finally, our moderator for today, Dr. Kent Calder, Director of the Edwin O. Reischauer Center for the East Asian Studies here at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He's a specialist in East Asian political economy. Dr. Calder has spent 11 years living and researching in Japan and 4 years elsewhere in East Asia. He has authored numerous books on Japanese politics and public policy, Asian energy, geopolitics, and U.S.-Japan relations and related topics. Before arriving at Hopkins, he taught for 20 years at Princeton University, was a visiting professor at Seoul National University, and a lecturer on government at Harvard University. He received his PhD from Harvard, where he worked under the direction of Edwin O. Reischauer. So that is our very distinguished panel, and I know you'll all want to join me in welcoming them to the stage.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very, very happy to be here with all of you. I actually grew up thinking that diplomacy was something that politicians did, something that actually took place in government buildings, something that took place somewhere very, very far away from where I was and from where I was living. I've been actually involved in community engagement and musical education for over 25 years now. And through my experiences of having brought music to children in different parts of the world, from the United States, from Asia, from Europe, in different places, I've actually learned that musicians can become very, very effective diplomats. Just to tell you a little bit about the video that you saw and how I see what you just heard as an example of diplomacy. Well, let me tell you that every year in December, I actually go with 3 young musicians to a developing country in Asia. This particular film you saw, which is from last December, was our trip to Nepal. The 3 young musicians came from China, from Israel, and from Argentina. They were all selected through a very vigorous and rigorous audition process to make a string quartet with me to go and visit to schools, to hospitals, to different special institutions in Nepal, to dedicate almost 5 weeks of their year to bringing music to children in Nepal, and also, again, 6 months later in Japan. So this film was just from about 2 weeks that we spent in Nepal. So as I said, these musicians come from different countries. We play the music that come from Germany, Schubert, that is, by Tchaikovsky, Russia, from Argentina, Ginastera, and really that we come together. And we are born in different places with many different backgrounds. We don't even speak the same language initially as babies when we're born. And we come together to play music, and of all places, we're making music together in Nepal, in some very remote villages in some cases. And the children that we meet there, they become very, very curious. First of all, they're seeing our instruments like violins, viola, and cello for the first time. They're hearing this type of music for the first time in their lives. They're hearing names of countries that they've never heard before: Israel, Argentina, Japan. Okay, well, Japan, okay, it's not so far. Okay, China is just across the mountains. But Israel, where is that? And Argentina. Oh, okay, well, I think we've heard of Argentina because of Messi. But then they ask, what are you doing here? Why are you playing together for us? What's your purpose? And why? There's so many questions. They ask, why? And this is where actually I believe this exchange, this diplomacy starts. That they become curious enough that we're together and we're enjoying this music together. And then, we're sharing this experience together. And this shared time is what actually really becomes very meaningful for us. And for the children that experience this music and this, sort of new faces and all kinds of things that are completely unimagined before, once they start to ask questions, it opens the door of curiosity, and they want to know more. And that connects very, very well and very strongly to their future. When they ask, they want to know more. And when they want to know more, they will keep asking the questions. And that helps them through school, that helps them to realize that there is a world beyond their immediate environment. And I think this is a very, very strong message that I have taken, having experienced these situations, and whether it's in Nepal or in Bangladesh or in Myanmar, Cambodia, all the places that I've been fortunate enough to go and make music and to share my music with. So as my remarks come to an end, I'd like to just reinforce how important it is that diplomacy isn't just something that happens with the politicians and making laws, but it actually is something that could happen with people by bringing people together, by encouraging people to really have a shared experience. And these things can make a difference. And I'm very, very, very honored to be able to be a part of that. And thank you also for listening to my remarks and what I had to say.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us again. My name is Jeff Brez. So I'm with the United Nations Department of Public Information. I want to talk about two briefly of our programs. So I'm not going to make any broad general statements about cultural diplomacy, but I really want to do is sort of give you an overview of some of the different things that we're doing, and then we can have more of a discussion when we all sit together and get some questions from the moderator and also from you. So the first thing that I want to talk about is this video that you just saw. It's basically grounded in what we call the Creative Community Outreach Initiative, which you could call a television and film office. It's our way to work with television, film, and other creative partners. As you can see, we've worked with everything from television sitcoms to blockbuster films, to reality TV, to documentary films, and also with celebrity advocates. And we have three sort of basic, simple objectives there. The first is to help us raise awareness about key UN issues like climate change, women's health, gender equality, etc. The second is to raise awareness and knowledge, the level of knowledge among the general public about the role of the United Nations. What is the United Nations doing on these topics? And the third, sometimes quite simply, is just about exposure, getting the UN visibly out there to broad audiences. So it's about reaching broader audiences, and it's about reaching new audiences, because the UN really does a lot of its own productions and a lot of communications, but sometimes, we really are communicating in a bubble, and it's hard for us to reach out to new audiences, both within certain countries and obviously around the world. So just to give you a couple of facts and figures on some of those programs that you saw Ugly Betty. The United Nations promotes bed netting to stop the spread of malaria in third world countries. 5 million people saw that. And that was just in the first time that it was shown on TV. Then there were reruns, and it was shown all around the world in different languages. Then we have A Chance of a Lifetime. You saw that it's a group of young filmmakers from India, United Arab Emirates, and Singapore. And it was sort of another reality competition among young people making films. And all the films that they made were about UN issues. And we gave them B-roll about their topics: climate change, poverty, hunger, water. We put them in touch, these young crews, with UN subject matter experts, for example. And so that's the way that we supported that production and the way that they depicted UN issues. And in the end, that was broadcast in India, so a huge audience of hundreds of thousands of people in September 2 years ago. The third example is Project Runway All-Stars. Some people at the UN asked the same question. What is a fashion show doing at the United Nations? What is this all about? And this, I think, is probably the softest of the three examples, but still very, very useful for the United Nations. The three finalists came to the United Nations, and basically, to boil it down, they were inspired by the United Nations to do their final challenge, so to create their final fashion for the judges. And so it was the United Nations, the place where 193 member states come together to solve the world's crises and to discuss pressing issues. Again, about 5 million people, the first viewership. Probably most of them a new audience for the United Nations. They were in the United Nations. The influencers, who was the judges, et cetera, said all positive, glowing things about the United Nations. The United Nations looks beautiful. Fantastic exposure for us. Now I'd like to talk a little bit more about specifically the work with what we can call celebrity advocates, or our messengers of peace. So if we can pull up that website. So first, a quick vocabulary lesson. You may have heard the term messenger of peace. You may have heard the term goodwill ambassador. Here's the difference. Good messengers of peace are designated by the Secretary General, and those relationships are managed by us in the Secretariat, so by our team. Midori is one of our messengers of peace, and I actually neglected to thank Midori, who's the one who invited me to come and speak, and I neglected to thank Dean Nasser and Dean Bernstein, and also SAIS for having me. So sorry about that delay. Thank you, and thank you all for coming. Rewind and rewind back. So this is our Messenger of Peace program. So as I said, we have a core team at the United Nations that sort of manages the relationships with these individuals. And what does it take to be a messenger of peace? What do you have to have? The messengers of peace, or goodwill ambassadors, are prominent figures from the areas of the arts, literature, academia, sports, and entertainment. But really the three things that matter are that they have recognition beyond their national borders so that they can help us advocate internationally, that they're committed on their issue, that they have a track record on their issue. You can't just pop up and say, I want to be a messenger of peace and raise awareness about hunger. No, you have to already have a track record on that, and you have to show commitment. Midori is a shining example of someone who is world-renowned in her field, and also unbelievably committed on the issues that she is a focus area in. All of the messengers of peace have a focus area. Midori's focus area is youth. She has also helped us advocate on issues relating to the health of newborn children, access for persons with disabilities, and other issues. So if we can we scroll up a tiny bit? Is that possible? So as I said, if not, that's okay. So just to mention very quickly a couple of the other messengers of peace, we have Daniel Barenboim, we have Paulo Coelho, who has a reach of tens of millions around the world. We have Michael Douglas, his focus area is disarmament. Midori, of course. Now, not all of these people I would put in the cultural diplomacy category. I think for me, you have cultural diplomacy when the primary activity of that person is really not that advocacy topic. It's sort of secondary, even no matter how strongly they feel about it and how much time they put into it. And Midori really puts an amazing amount of time into this. So a couple of the impacts, and then I'll wrap up, of just some of the things that these individuals have accomplished or done with the United Nations. So Midori, in addition to being here with you today, she travels every year to a developing country with some support, but really it's her organizations doing most of the work from the United Nations country team there. She went to Nepal this year. It's a country that's typically post-crisis, and so she goes, one of the reasons why she chooses the places she goes is to not let those emergencies, crisis situations become forgotten even a year or two after, as they're still trying to rehabilitate. She has done public service announcement for us. She recently, on December 2nd, came to the United Nations for an event on accessible cities, and she not only performed for the audience, but she also shared her own experiences in working with venues to increase the level of access for persons with disabilities to performances. Going up a little bit more, we have Leo DiCaprio. He spoke at the Climate Summit in 2014. He regularly uses his social media channels to advocate on issues relating to climate change and what the UN is doing. Another fantastic partner. Edward Norton, Stevie Wonder, okay, a good example. He, actually I have this written down, he worked, so his focus area is persons with disabilities. He was very, very active for years in supporting the World Intellectual Property Rights Organization, a treaty to facilitate access to published work for persons who are blind, visually impaired, and print disabled. He advocated directly with the General Assembly, and in 2013 he traveled to Marrakesh as they were doing their final deliberations to really, as he said, make sure that they signed, sealed, and delivered this treaty, which they did in 2013. And he came back on the topic in 2016 to urge more countries to adopt the treaty and to put it into implementation. So those are just a couple of examples. So what are we looking for in impact? They're helping us increase our audience size. They're helping us reach different audiences. They're helping us sort of improve the impact of the messages that we send out. They give us convening power, and I think Ashley, who's talking next about Charlize, they're an Africa outreach project, is going to talk about Charlize's convening of bringing different people together that you wouldn't necessarily expect to advocate together on different topics. To talk about the reduction of the transmission of HIV/AIDS. So the impact is there, their commitment is there, and we are very, very proud to work with them, and I look forward to talking more. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I really hate coming after Charlize on anything. You never feel very good about yourself following her. And thank you. I firstly want to say I'm so honored to be here. Thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this discussion. I have been working with Charlize for over 12 years now. And if any of you are fans or have seen any of her work, you would probably agree with me. She is a force of nature. She's an incredible artist, incredible actress. But to me, what's been most inspiring is her work as a humanitarian, and I feel very privileged to be able to work with her in that capacity. She started the foundation, the Charlize Theron Africa Outreach Project, in 2007, and at the time, it was really meant to be a mechanism for her to give back to her home country of South Africa. South Africa is the country with the highest population of HIV-positive individuals in the world. The country makes up 1% of the world's total population, but 19% of the world's HIV-positive population. So obviously, this really struck a chord for her, having grown up there, and she wanted to do something about it. She had a vision for a future where all young people, no matter where they were born, would be able to live healthy, productive, HIV-free lives. And so she took a step back and said, okay, how can I best be of service to this vision? And knowing that in South Africa, what she was seeing is that a lot of young people weren't having that opportunity, whether it be from lack of information or lack of access to health services or stigma or gender inequity. She wanted to really not just build a grant-making organization, but build it based off of the assets that she knew she had as a person who is in the limelight and who had the spotlight and the power to do more than just simply grant make, even though we do grant make. So the strategy behind the foundation was really built around who Charlize is and what she could bring to the table. So I wanted to share with you a couple ways that we really think to build off of that. First is probably the most obvious, which is fundraising. We do a lot of our fundraising that, attached to something like a new movie she has coming out. So she just recently had Fate of the Furious premiere, and we did a whole online campaign around that to build funds, and then we take those funds and grant make to community-based orgs in South Africa. We also just had our annual fundraiser, which was an event in Orange County, and we were really honored to have former First Lady Mrs. Laura Bush come and speak, and she did a moderated conversation with Charlize. And it was incredible to see those two women on stage together and have them talk about their shared passion for seeing the end of AIDS. I think it was a really unlikely pairing that people were very intrigued by. But we realized that this would never be possible to have a conversation like that if we didn't have someone like Charlize at our helm. Another piece that we really think about is partnerships and bringing new players into this conversation and into this issue. So for us, our longest partner has been TOMS. And we've been able to do 3 different shoes with them, CTOP shoes and a bag, which obviously helps on the fundraising side. But more interesting to me is the fact that TOMS had never done any work in HIV prevention for young people in Africa. And they've since become an incredible partner, and they help us raise awareness around this issue, and we're hoping will be our partner in this issue for a long time. And then we have partners on the other end. Like Jeff mentioned, Charlize is a UN messenger of peace, so we partner with the UN, and we partner with UNAIDS, and we partner with the Global Fund. And what we're able to do with their expertise and their history and their reach is help to educate Charlize when she's speaking, but also help to take all that knowledge learned and funnel it down to the grassroots level where our grantees are working. So there's this really beautiful exchange of knowledge that goes both ways that we've been able to create through Charlize as the connector. And then the last piece I would say that she brings is her spotlight. Charlize has been given a microphone on a global stage, and she is not afraid to use it. So she's spoken at CGI, she's spoken at Davos, she's spoken to Congress, done op-ed pieces, spoken at We Day, spoken at the International AIDS Conference, which you saw a piece of, which was, I think, her best speech yet. And this works not only because she has this mega platform, but it works because there's an authenticity to her. And it's not just because she's South African, it's because she has the foundation and she's going down every year and she's doing like Midori's doing. She is there speaking with young people, she's hearing their stories, and then she's taking it back to a global stage and she's sharing that story. So they truly are messengers. And I think that piece too often goes overlooked, of the authenticity. Instead of just standing up and sharing a message, there really needs to be a continued investment in an issue, and Charlize definitely has done that. So the last piece I would just say, and this struck me as I was preparing for today, is all of us at CTOP, including Charlize, believe that the next generation will be the ones who have the ability to end AIDS for good. And we're invested in this, and so we've been working with our peers to start a movement of a younger generation called Gen End It, Generation to End AIDS. And it struck me as much as the last 7 minutes I've been talking about how great Charlize is and how we use her as the backbone to our strategy, and she's this incredible individual, but I really believe her power at the end of the day will not be about what she does herself as an individual, but what she empowers others to do. And that's what I'm really excited to see. And thank you.
Hello, I'm Evan Ryan. I'm the recent Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs. And how many in this room have heard of jazz diplomacy? So that is the beginning of what we're all here today to talk about. Back in the 50s, to help counter the wave of communism and in in the middle of the Cold War, the United States government sent jazz musicians to the Eastern Bloc and actually to countries all around the world as an example of freedom of expression, the overall openness and cultural diversity of the United States and what it represented. And today, that tradition continues at the State Department. And today, what also continues is the very strategic goals of cultural diplomacy that we had back then still remain. Many people think, when you hear of the Bureau of Education and Cultural Affairs and you think of our cultural programs, that perhaps we're just sending musicians or cultural representatives to any places around the world. Amy Bliss, who's here with us today and is at the State Department and oversees the cultural programs, can attest to the fact that we're very strategic at the State Department. And I'll waver back and forth between past tense and present because I'm still not used to not being present. And that we're very strategic with our programs and where we send our representatives. So at the State Department, the cultural programs, there are dance programs, musical programs, film programs, and sports programs. And what we found is that these programs are actually amongst the most important soft power tools that the State Department is able to employ. I was able to see this firsthand when I arrived as Assistant Secretary, and one of the first communiques that I received was about a part of Western China that we'd not been able to do much in, a town. But this whole area we hadn't been able to do much in terms of the State Department. The ambassador had attempted to go, other representatives from the United States, speakers, representatives from universities had tried to go into these areas, into this town. We offered the town an NBA basketball player, and after a constant wave of no's over the course of years, we received a resounding yes. So the basketball player went into the town, the entire town showed up. He conducted clinics. It was written about in the local media and attributed to the US government and the US Embassy, which was absolutely unheard of, that we would be given this credit as the US government. And it was all because he represented sports and was non-threatening in that fashion. And that, for us, opened up a door to be able to continue a dialogue that we would not have been able to open the door if we had not had that tool, that sports tool to use. And we've seen that time and again through all the programs that Amy runs and all of these different tools that we have, whether they be film or music or dance or sports. And it's really amazing to see the open arms where you'll see around the world with people welcoming American culture in a way that they will not welcome American policy or American representatives, especially official representatives of the United States government. So what we found is that the cultural programs, although soft power in the traditional sense of the word, were actually the most strategic, most important tools that we could use in the State Department and as on behalf of the US government. What we also did as well, and they do continue to do at the State Department, is we also would bring cultural representatives from around the world here to the United States, and we would sponsor those visits here to the US. When I was there, one program that really remained with me and one experience was a Pakistani pop rock group called Poor Rich Boy. This group, and we would work closely with the embassies in identifying these cultural representatives to come to the United States. But this group was very special, we found, because they had a huge following in Pakistan. 2 million or more Facebook followers, young people across the country would show up in Pakistan to see them. So when we bring groups like this to the United States, what we would do is look at not New York, not Los Angeles, not Chicago, but smaller cities, mid-sized cities or smaller cities where we could bring these groups or sports teams or any of these cultural representatives that we would have also reciprocal programs to bring here. We would bring them to those smaller sized cities where populations might not normally have an opportunity to see a musical group from Pakistan or a soccer player from Argentina. And then these people in the communities would have a sense of these young people from Pakistan, of their way of life, of their culture, as a result of these visits. At the culmination of their program, Poor Rich Boy came back to Washington, and they were hosted at the Kennedy Center. We had a great partnership with the Kennedy Center. I think we still do. And they played at the Millennium Stage at the Kennedy Center. And the response in the audience for this band was very talented, was just overwhelming. The audience was on their feet. They had a standing ovation. And on stage, after the standing ovation, the lead singer was practically in tears. And he said, "I never expected to be welcomed this way in the United States. That's not what I thought. That's not what I was told. That's not what I was told to expect." And he said, in every city I've gone to, and here today in Washington, D.C., this kind of response, he said, it's really overwhelming to me. And as the State Department, as the U.S. government, you see that singer walk off stage, and all you think is, he's bringing that sentiment back to Pakistan and back to his fans and to his friends and his family. So as an investment, you can't even quantify the value in that. So that's why strategically the programs, all the programs that you'll hear about today, are hugely important to our relationships around the world. They build those bridges and establish those relationships, and most importantly, open those doors where they're shut otherwise to U.S. government and U.S. policy. So I want to thank Dean Nasser and Dean Bernstein for hosting us here today, because I think this is a very important discussion. So thank you.
I think we've all found this discussion to be moving, important, and as Dean Bernstein said, also an extraordinary group of participants here. There's not really a great deal that I could add. Being a student of Edmund Reischauer and with the George Packard, who founded the Reischauer Center here in our audience, I can't help recalling the first lines of Edwin Reischauer's book, The United States and Japan. He said, "The United States and Japan face each other only across an ocean, but it's the broadest ocean in the world." And of course, that's true of the Pacific Ocean, but I think he was really speaking more poetically about cross-cultural relations and the importance of somehow being able to communicate across cultures. As Dean Nasser talked about beginnings, that this can be important, cultural diplomacy important, where relationships are just beginning or whether other approaches are not productive. So I think probably all of us here have had experiences of this kind of cross-cultural communication and the soft power, as Evan was suggesting, that comes from a musical experience or an artistic experience or film or some sort of close group experience where we communicate it across cultures. Maybe to start out our discussion, and of course we would like also to broaden this into, after just a little bit of exchange, to broaden this into a general discussion about what cultural diplomacy is and as one of the important toolboxes, not the only one, but why it's important. I'd like to begin asking Midori about something that quite intrigued me, a phrase that she used in her remarks. She said near the end that cultural diplomacy opens doors of curiosity. And she's just seen this in Nepal, as we saw from her video. I wonder if you could just say a little more about that, about what have you actually seen, kind of experiences have you had where doors of curiosity get opened through the sorts of programming that you do?
What I find powerful, actually, is that by nature of just 4 different musicians coming together, 4 different musicians of very different backgrounds, and playing the music of different times, children actually start to get interested in us as as persons, of course, but in our countries, our cultures, our interests. They're interested in us as human beings, but they're also interested with what we actually represent. And then also as the question of why we come together. This international collaboration. Why are we interested in this international collaboration? It actually makes them also get interested in history. It also gets them interested in different cultures, their own cultures, perhaps their own dance. You saw at the very end of the film that we were all dancing together. And that was a dance from this village where everything was destroyed in the recent earthquake, and that we're sharing this time together. This curiosity, for me, is the start of really becoming aware of the world that's beyond our immediate environment, and really very closely making an impact, a very important impact in education and global development.
I guess, Jeff and Ashley, you've seen this sort of thing too, haven't you?
Thanks. Yes, I like the way of talking about opening a door of curiosity, because I think that Project Runway All-Stars, that not particularly heavy piece of entertainment actually opens the door for curious people. It's sort of a non-threatening way to bring the United Nations into people's homes. They're inside the United Nations, yes, albeit through television. They're being exposed to the United Nations. They're hearing the people that they trust say nice things about the United Nations. It doesn't mean they're going to make decisions about what they think about the United Nations, but the next time they read about the United Nations, or they see a United Nations campaign, or whatever it is, I think that their minds are going to be that much more open to listening and to learning about the United Nations. And I think there are lots of different, that's the soft part of the diplomacy, is just like a non-threatening way of sort of getting yourself a little bit into people's hearts.
I was just going to say, when you were speaking, Midori, it made me think of when we've been out on trips with Charlize, and one of the things she always says up front when she's talking to a large group of young people is, there are people that I'm here representing who care about you, and there are people who have donated to us that care about you, and I want to share that with you. And even when we did, like at the Tom's Shoes, they sent shoes for the kids to use for school, and she was saying, there's a man named Blake that cares about you, and he wants to know about you. And so there's a curiosity on the going this way too, and the fact that you're saying, I'm curious about you and I care about you, it really holds a lot of strength. So it's not just that they're curious about you as the artist and where you come from, it's showing that you're curious about them, and that it's so meaningful.
And actually, that's a very important point. Yeah, there's always interest and curiosity from both sides, because as I mentioned very, very briefly, the second part of this program actually takes place in Japan, which for this year is next month. And with the same group of young musicians, I'm going to be visiting different special institutions, different schools, different special residences. And we're going to be talking about what we experienced in Nepal, what we've learned, what we've experienced. And it's not only to do with children, but just our everyday observations, just really just a personal experience of having been in this very, very beautiful, very special country. For me, for example, I definitely will be talking about how I was just awestruck by the beauty of the nature of the Himalayas, and how I felt so humbled about, just by being there, but, what I actually probably am not doing to support environmental causes. And I felt really, really ashamed when I was there. And to be able to share this experience, perhaps there will be something that would actually strike a chord in our audiences in Japan, that they would decide then to take over and do something about it.
You've taken your ideas back to Japan, I guess, a number of times. You do find this, that things travel, so many of your international experiences strike a chord in Japan?
Definitely, and particularly because I work with children, I talk to the children in Japan about children in Nepal or children in Bangladesh or children in Cambodia, and that they all have shared interests as well. They love sports, they love soccer, and yes, they get spanked by their parents at times, perhaps, or okay, they have to sometimes go to school and not always the most, interesting topics perhaps for adults, but for children, these are very, very important.
Surely.
And to feel that they're connected, across borders, across different time zones. different
Certainly
cultures.
that connection across borders is one of our major themes, and we see the universality of cultural diplomacy, but certainly there are certain cases or certain times when it's particularly effective. I don't know, I was struck, Evan, by some of what you talked about taking the NBA to Pakistan. Where do you think it's cultural diplomacy? Of course, we have there's a lot of tools in the toolbox. When do you find that this is particularly important?
Well, exactly. Both of those examples I found really resonated because they showed that in places where we were having trouble operating on a policy basis sometimes, people are always open to American culture. And another example of that is in Russia. Over the past few years, as the relationship has frayed a bit, our ambassador in Russia talked about how important and more important than ever the cultural programs were, that Russians were still very interested. Suzanne Farrell recently went, the prima ballerina, was in Russia just a couple of years ago, and many Russians showed up to see her. And so that leaves that tie and that thread and that window, I would say, open between our cultures and our countries in a way that's really important when there are other parts of our interactions, and especially diplomatic interactions, that are not thriving or going well. So we do, I know, and Amy also who's still here, who's here, and her team, we are very strategic and have been very strategic about ensuring that we are deploying the cultural programs very carefully to the areas where we do need them most. And we have found that no matter where you go, it's really uncanny. You will find that even in places where America is not welcome in a pretty severe way, they still welcome American culture, whether that be music, film, television. There's a real openness and a real, honestly, an interest, actually, in American culture. And that's something that we as a country need to capitalize on.
Mm-hmm.
I can
Yes,
add
Jeff.
a couple of examples, I think, of the specific impact that you get. So, for example, I mentioned that Midori came in December, and she attended and also performed at a very important event on World Disabilities Day on accessible cities. Now, because she came, we know that not only was attendance boosted, but also I hate to use this word quality of attendance because everyone is important, but the level of the importance, I guess, of decision makers in the decision-making hierarchy obviously is going to be higher. So that is it's countable, it's quantifiable in terms of the impact that Midori, for example, brings. At the Climate Summit, Leonardo DiCaprio spoke. Okay, so now we're comparing apples and oranges a little bit, but the Secretary General spoke and also President Obama spoke. The Secretary General got about 20,000 hits on UN Web TV. President Obama got somewhere between, I forget the number, 40 and 50,000. In one day, Leonardo DiCaprio had 2 million hits, right? So obviously, it's not the same impact. The Secretary General delivering a message and Barack Obama delivering a message to the President of the United States at the time, and Leo DiCaprio are different things, but clearly there's a big impact for someone like Leo coming and reaching that many people. And those numbers have been dwarfed since then. If it's all over the place on YouTube, on the UN's websites, et cetera. So huge numbers. And there was one more example I wanted to give you. It's not coming to me. But So I'll leave it at that.
You see a lot of this too, don't you, Ashley?
Well, I was
Yeah.
going to build on what you were saying. What's interesting is that those people who are watching, the Leo watchers, are what's valuable is that they're not the converted, right? So they're not the people who are maybe normally turning into UNTV, no offense, right? But it is valuable beyond just the number itself because you're speaking to a new audience.
Exactly, and just so, here's the third point, sorry. So the social media effect is also very important. So there was actually some research done, and I'm just going to read it to you because I don't want to get the numbers wrong. So this is a response to Leonardo DiCaprio's speech at the Oscars when he won his Oscar. So tweets mentioning climate change or global warming were 636% higher than expected the day he spoke. That's 600%, so 6 times higher. And the total number of tweets that contained the specific phrases climate change or global warming were at the highest recorded value in the database, with more than 250,000 tweets on that day. And also Google searches were impacted, that it spiked so much that they represented the 3rd highest point ever recorded for climate change or global warming on Google Trends. So it doesn't mean you've necessarily won those people over, but it's opens a huge window of opportunity to interact with those people and get the messages out and keep that conversation opportunity going and hopefully nudge in the right direction.
Mm-hmm. Well, we certainly, with many distinguished diplomats in the audience and people with lots of experience in that area, no one is depreciating the importance of cultural diplomacy in the formal sense. And Evan, of course, has pointed out some clear examples of how government actually does use that effectively. But I think in a small sort of a conclusion, because I know we've got lots of thoughts and comments from the audience as well, I come back to something that Midori said right at the end of her talk. She said, diplomacy is not just among politicians. It is shared experience. And of course, culture in its varied forms, music, the way that you do, and through the arts in a variety of forms, of course, it does create that sort of shared experience, as we know, as sports does, as the movies of Leonardo DiCaprio or whatever it happens to be also do. So there's sort of both of those tracks, the formal side, the diplomatic side, but also the shared experience of a much broader variety of forms, and how that can help to deepen our understanding, how it can help to promote peace or to promote important transformations in the world, I think is certainly something that, an objective that we all share. I don't know if people have questions. I see one right there. Also, if you could just identify yourself and then please, your comments.
I'm Sherry Mueller. I teach cultural diplomacy at the School of International Service at AU.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the hardest things is when you focus on the wonderful examples that you all have given, and I'm very grateful for them, the discrepancy of resources available for these kinds of programs, if you look in the United States, roughly $600 billion for the Pentagon and not even $1 billion for cultural diplomacy. How do we change that?
I can speak to that a little bit. So that's an excellent question, and I know that in the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs, we all are very focused on Capitol Hill and trying to communicate with them. But it really is a question of being able to show those connections. And the problem is it's very hard to really draw the lines. I think Jeff drew some good lines in terms of social media and real connections and recognition in that front. But when it comes to policy connections and policy advancement, the best arguments you can come up with are the ones where you can show that because we had this musical group from Pakistan here in the United States, we were able to move the needle in terms of Pakistani relations. And I think what's really challenging is the cultural programs and the cultural diplomacy that we undertake is usually very long-term. I know that what we focused on in terms of cultural programs in the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs is really, we were very geared towards a young audience, with the understanding that if we could help acquaint them with American culture early on, that they would then become more receptive to us as a culture and as a country, and that would pay off down the road, and sometimes that means decades down the road. So being able to draw those lines and draw those ties is something that we would always endeavor to do. That being said, I will say that the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs enjoys tremendous support from Capitol Hill and has about $500 million budget for just the Bureau. And that actually is really good news, I will say, because the FY17 budget just received an increase in the recent omnibus. And so that was an incredibly, I think, validating signal from Congress for these programs. And so working with Congress closely is a big part of it.
Anyone else?
I'll
Yes,
just
Jim.
add that I think, it's very difficult to show the return on investment. Money talks in this world. So to be able to really quantify the impact, so this research, I should have said, actually came out of San Diego State University, University of California, San Diego, and the Santa Fe Institute. So that's where those numbers are from. I can give you the source. But that obviously type of input is impact. Quantitative data is very, very helpful in terms of saying, well, we're having an impact, right? So you should fund this. But sometimes it's very difficult. Recently has anyone seen the show here in the United States, Mysteries of Laura? Anyone? Okay. All right. Okay, we have one person. So they wanted to film at the UN. There was nothing UN related in the script, and we thought, really, does this make sense? What are we going to get out of it? So we talked to them a little bit and got them to put in one fun line about the UN in the script. And so the main character is sort of staking out across the street, looking at the United Nations where something's happening. And as a side comment, she says, wow, 193 countries agreed on climate change. I can't even get my kids to agree on breakfast cereal. But that was our big moment. We were like, it was right after the climate summit, the Paris Agreement had been agreed. We said 193 countries, member states, boom, that's one. Climate agreement had been agreed at the United Nations, So how many people registered that or would remember that? How much? That's something that maybe a little bit of focus grouping would help us with. So that's always we're trying to, in addition to do it, measure the impact of what we're doing, which costs a little bit more money too, right? So it's a challenge.
It's interesting though. That came out of a university. You said the
Yes.
numbers, and you work at a university, and we're here at a university. I just think it's a real opportunity for all of us to just be
Please help
investing
us
more
with the
in
research.
this, right?
My whole graduate practicum was focused on advocacy. That's all.
I think, Midori, I don't know if you want to add to that. We certainly want to come back to you for some final thoughts in the end, but I see a question right here. Yes? And then maybe one there and then one in the back. We have a little more time, sure. Maybe if we could hear the questions. Why don't we take 2 or 3 questions together, you and this gentleman, and then the lady in the back there, the 3 of you, and then get some responses as quickly as we can.
Sure, thanks. Rob Colorina. A question for Midori and Ashley. To what extent do the messengers have input on where you all go? And then just related, what's the angle for the corporate sector to either co-sponsor? Is it a programmatic thing, or is it sort of if they want to sponsor or co-sponsor, if that's eligible, a particular city or country?
Okay, so the logistics, where people go and then co-sponsoring regarding the messengers. Yes, the second
Hello,
question.
my name is Akshay from India. Yeah. I basically have 2 questions, but I don't know if I can actually put forward 2 questions. So am I allowed to pose 2 questions?
Yes, that's, if you could, please, just pose a question.
Okay. The first question is, okay. So how much is cultural hegemony embedded in cultural diplomacy? The reason I ask this question is because when you pursue cultural diplomacy, for example, any country or the US does, and for example, India does, so there might be also chances of conflict as well in the cultural domain itself. So how are we trying to, negotiate or on that terms? And secondly, my question to Ma'am Midori is, when you travel across the world and when you are actually playing various music on your instruments and trying to forge peace, so do you actually stick to just one domain of music, or is it that you also try to adapt yourself to the different areas that you go? So yeah,
I
these are
see.
two questions.
The variety of music that you use. Yes, and then the third question.
Yeah, hi, I'm Shweta, I'm a student here at SAIS. I think my question is about the approach that cultural diplomacy undertakes. So the sense that I got was that cultural diplomacy as such is a very outward-looking process, and it's very people-oriented in that sense. But my question was, how effective is this entire idea of cultural diplomacy if there are leaders often who then adopt a very inward-looking approach? And do those two necessarily have to clash, or can they carry on in a parallel sense? Yeah, I just wanted your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, that's a big question. It has to do a bit with policy. I don't know, perhaps we could start across with Evan, and people could have some final comments responding to
Sure.
some of the questions.
So first of all, I just want to go to your question for a moment. One thing I should have mentioned is, and this also goes to resources, recently we've had real success at the State Department in partnering with the private sector in helping to sponsor some of these programs. And so that is one area. I think this also goes to the previous question as well. So many companies right now in the United States want to be philanthropically responsible and active, and this is one way, because many companies want to be global, that they've found that they can partner. And so we've had success working with ESPNW and Bloomberg and other entities in terms of partnering and help sponsor some of the programs. In terms of cultural hegemony, it's a really good question, and it's actually something, if I may, just one quick anecdote, because it's so pervasive, American culture, and this is actually for Ashley as well. When I was visiting Egypt and I was speaking to a group of young people who were taking one of the English classes that we taught in the State Department, there was an opportunity for these young students who were high school age students to ask me questions afterwards. And one young man raised his hand and he said, do you see drag races all the time in the United States? And I said, actually, I've never seen a drag race in my life.
I don't believe it.
And he said, that's impossible. You live in the United States. And I said, no, I've never seen a drag race. And he goes, well, then clearly you haven't been to Miami. And I said, I have. Well, it turns out he was a huge Fast and the Furious fan. And the reason I wanted to say that also for Ashley's benefit is everywhere I traveled around the world, Fast and the Furious was huge amongst young people. So in terms of the question on hegemony, I mean, it's just a fact of life, and it's because of the power of Hollywood and also our music. Everywhere I went to, I'd be in a hotel elevator, and the elevator music was American. So it's really something that we do have to consider, and there are times where there are those clashes and conflicts, and people do not welcome our culture, and they do not want it to be there, and so I can address the question in the back row as well in a similar vein. And I think the most important thing there is some cultural sensitivity and this sense of really also having that reciprocity and showing that we as Americans are very interested in learning about other cultures as well. And I think when you do that, it can also address a leader who is inward looking and who does not want to break down barriers. Everyone, and this is just a basic tenet of humanity, when you show interest in someone else and in their culture and in their life, that opens them up. And so even in these closed states and closed to American culture or otherwise, when you show that interest in another country's culture and background and history, I think that's a tremendously important and powerful way to connect. But of course, there will be barriers. There'll be barriers where people feel like American culture is too pervasive. But the fact of the matter is, we have an industry that is just immensely powerful, and it really is Hollywood. I mean, it's everywhere I went around the world, when I spoke to young people, that's really their number one topic, was they were very well acquainted with our movies, whether it was Fast and the Furious and that series, which is just, I mean, I actually spoke in Hollywood a little bit about this when I was still in my old job. It was uncanny, the number of young people around the world who were invested and interested in that film. And whether it's that or our music, it is really everywhere you travel and everywhere you turn. So the question is, how can we use that and help build bridges and not offend and not push people away? And that gets tricky, and that's a whole nother panel, because that gets a little bit into freedom of speech and propaganda, which we don't want to get into, but it's really finding ways to build those bridges and connect through what we view as tremendous soft power here in the United States.
Thanks very much.
I'll be brief, but I wanted to touch on all those points. So on the cultural hegemony side of things, I think for the UN it's very important to work with a range of different partners from different regions. So many of the examples that we gave today did come out of Hollywood, but we just worked recently with an Indian Bollywood production that filmed at the United Nations. It's called Half Girlfriend. It's about to come out in India. It's in the headlines over there, so we're actually hoping that'll be sort of a new wave of Bollywood films having interest in coming to film at the United Nations. So fingers crossed, we're very excited about that. But always looking, and even the sort of representation that we have in our Messengers of Peace, we keep a very close eye on the regional representation and also gender balance. So that's very, very important. So we're not just using American culture, but sort of global culture. And more, it's not just Hollywood, but other places where that global culture, and at least beyond national borders, that culture is emanating from. And we also work at the national level, obviously, with all sorts of people and sort of national goodwill ambassadors. On the corporate side, some of these are actually public-private partnerships. Some of the characters and partners that we've worked with, for example, recently the Smurfs, I mean, they're actually a brand. So it's almost a new frontier of public-private partnership, and that's a whole other discussion. But the UN is very careful about aligning itself or not with commercial products. So that's a fine line that we have to walk, and just as long as you have the right partner willing to work with you in the right way, you can achieve amazing things. And actually we had outreach with the Smurfs on a recent campaign called Small Smurfs, Big Goals, about the Sustainable Development Goals, where we reached over 800 million people and had exposure in the media worth over $30 million. So really tremendous impact there with a corporate partnership. And the last thing is this, if you have, maybe a leadership approach that is more inward-looking or not. So your cultural diplomacy helps you, in any case, reach out to those audiences that you're trying to reach. And also, I think that convening power we talked about is so important, in situations like that. So different cultural, ambassadors from different sectors can really help you bring people together and sort of let the politics float aside, ideally.
Thank you, Jeff. Ashley?
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts. I'm not sure. Really quickly on the corporate side, I can speak specifically about Charlize and what we do. And we definitely have partners who come in on our trips. And I touched on it in my remarks, but I think for us, it's really important to actually try and bring in different industries, because the whole point is, like the Leo video, to bring in to convert. We want people to care about this issue, and we don't just want the same people to care about this issue, because we need everybody if we're going to see the end of AIDS. So yes is my answer. If you're interested, let's talk after. And then I was going to comment on what you were saying, Evan, about Fast and the Furious, and just I know I didn't talk about this at all because it's much more of a personal thing for Charlize, but I know that she does really take seriously the roles she chooses and how women are represented in those roles. And I think it speaks to how important partnerships like this, like what Charlize as a UN Messenger of Peace, with UNAIDS is because it keeps it in her mind to be thinking about these issues constantly, and it plays out in what CTOP does, but it also plays out in her career, and who knows, like you said, what that means to the 16-year-old girl in KwaZulu-Natal who sees this film and sees a powerful woman portrayed. You just don't know. So the power of partnerships is my ending statement.
Well, thank you. And then, of course, most importantly, Midori.
Just to answer some of the questions that I may have some direct answers to, I think one had to do with whether how much we have a say, whether Elise or I have a say in where to go. Actually, in my case, I will speak for myself, I have 100% say in where I'm going to go because the UN actually, in fact, one of the first questions that Jeff asked me today when we met, where are you going this December? And
how can we support?
Yes. And so when I told him, actually, we're going to India this December, and he, was delighted with the fact that, my organization, the Board of Trustees of Music Sharing, have chosen India as this year's destination for the program because the UN has very, very meaningful and very important work that they're doing there. It's not only there, but it's one of the places that they felt, well, Jeff feels that he could be very helpful in helping in getting us actually organized and making recommendations to us where to go, connecting us to different organizations there, and so that we can actually go and visit and we can connect and we can work with the children and we can really exchange. So actually the places where I go are not chosen by the UN, but it's an independent work that I do either through my organization, one of my organizations, or just as a person, as a performer. And then what we do is that we bring these destinations, or we bring, the idea of the project to the UN, to Jeff, and Jeff says, great, we have the capacity to be able to connect you with such and such and such and such and such and such. But it doesn't often happen that the UN comes to me and says, please go to this place or that place. So yeah, I do have a full say in where I go. And it's really, it's worked very, very nicely that we were able to work together with the UN for the last several programs we've done, especially because it has enabled us also to go to places where normally we won't have access to. For instance, to restricted areas in Bangladesh, to different places in Myanmar, to the IDPs, internally displaced persons camps. And they were very, very important experiences, very important trips, very important visits that we've made. And we couldn't have gone without the support of the UN. But we weren't the ones that actually said to the UN, tell us where to go. We first said we were going to this area, and then they were able to support us. And then specifically with the question of whether I modify some of the music that I play. Of course, actually, when we go and visit wherever it is in December, as much as possible, we try to collaborate, first of all, with local musicians, local artists. That's a very, very important part of our program. Not all the countries have music as the most prominent form of their traditional arts. In some cultures, dance is very, very important. In some cultures, it's music, but in other places, it's different. So there are always, differences, and then we're always working with individual communities and individual countries, but there are some differences there. Granted, though, we work as much as possible with the local musicians, local artists. We also try to actually play something, whether it's sometimes a national anthem or something that's very, very popular with the children. and try to exchange. We also try to play things from Japan or from different countries. And for us, for classical musicians, finding music from Europe is not difficult. But sometimes, we also play music from other countries as well. As a soloist, as a performer, outside of my organizations, I go and play in different countries, and most of the time I'm working with local orchestras. Attached to my performances, I often work with local students, local musician students there in that community. And sometimes they bring in, for me to listen to, the music that are written in their community or in their country that represents their country. So in that way, there is a good exchange. And sometimes I actually become very fond of this music that's introduced to me, and then actually I take it to other places as well.
Thank you very much. In the beginning of our discussion here, Evan said something that I think in a way summarizes much of what we've said today, that showing cultural interest is a powerful way to connect. And I think we've seen that in what's been heard here today. Personally, I've learned a tremendous lot. I appreciate, I think we all do, the initiative that the Peabody took, Dean Brownstein, in helping to bring this together, this kind of a cooperation between a public policy school and the arts. I think you can see the quality in what he started mentioning, the insights. And I think we all agree that this group, that we've learned something, I hope, and we appreciate what people have said. Thank you very much.